Welcome to the Dealist, the insider's guide to M&A. My name is Catherine Ford, and I'm your host for today. Today, we're going to be talking about deal leaks and how to preserve confidentiality during an M&A process. I'm delighted to have been joined by Matt Wells, Vice President of Product Marketing at Intralinks, Dan Scorpio, Head of M&A and Activism at communications firm H Advisors Abernathy, and Nitin Kumar, an independent marketing commentator. Thank you to all three of you so much for joining us today. Let's get straight stuck into the topic. As we all know, deal leaks can have an outsized impact on M&A transactions and the success of M&A transactions. Let's start, Dan, by talking to you a little bit about how we can differentiate between planned leaks and unplanned leaks. First of all, why do you think leaks actually happen when it comes to an M&A process?
So thanks, Catherine. There are many reasons that a leak might happen in an M&A process. And I think your question is exactly right. It's helpful to start to distinguish between a planned or a strategic leak and an unplanned leak. On the planned side, you certainly see situations where parties involved in a transaction may feel like they could gain an advantage in that process by leaking information externally to the media, whether it's to put pressure on another party, to try to take pole position, or something like that. We also see in our jobs where we may try to work with a specific reporter within a day or so of an announcement to try to control how a transaction is perceived by the market. And so we might actually work with a company to try to place a story with a reporter in the media in advance, which technically would count as a leak, but it's much more of a planned process trying to keep some control over how the market perceives your transaction. On the unplanned side, there always are mistakes that happen. And one answer to that sometimes is unpopular, but is true, is that M&A reporters are just very good at their jobs. They are really talented at assessing sources and assessing information and asking the right questions at the right time to the right people to piece together a story about a deal.
Nitin, let me come to you. There was a piece of research that Intralinks recently did, and it looked at data and discovered that actually the percentage of deals that are leaked has remained relatively stable over the last few years. Do we actually just have to accept that if you are doing an M&A transaction, leaks will happen? Is there actually any way that we can get rid of them completely out of a process?
I think you have to put this in perspective, right? If you look at what deals generally leak, they're on the larger side and public side. The number of deals, the percentage has skewed in the private side over the last 5 years or so, right? So there's limited value in leaking them unless there is malintent or sabotage or an accidental leak. The private capital markets are the aggregate of those deals are higher than the public. Now, in the public markets, I think Dan alluded to that perfectly, that there are some intentional leaks. The unintentional leaks are growing. And I think until there's education, it's impossible to take it to zero. And the impossibilities really stem from third-party advisors not trained. You have receptionists, you have social media people connecting with all kinds of investment bankers. You can discern and put 2 out of 2. Now, one of the biggest challenges is that people in M&A are trained on the legal process and the fiduciary duties. They aren't really trained on cybersecurity, right? And I can see all kinds of M&A software with people querying ChatGPT for XYZ things. So that can all go into public databases. So it's like training and awareness can minimize it. I think the net zero is like a singularity, which may or may not be ever attained.
Matt, can I bring you into this conversation as well? Because Nitin there spoke about, what's the value of a deal leak? Can I first of all ask you on your take of that? Where do you think the value in leaking a transaction can come from? And let's spend some time talking about confidentiality and how that can be maintained. But first of all, let's look back to that issue of value.
Yeah, from a value standpoint, I think there's a vast number of reasons that may be the catalyst behind why somebody may choose to leak a deal or not. Again, I think it does go back to that intentional versus unintentional. But there are many reasons that may have sort of perceived value, whether it's to accelerate deal timelines. I think it's going to put pressure on the deal to help force a quicker close. A lot of times, according to the research that we've done with the Bay School, that's actually been the opposite case, and these leak deals can actually then take longer because there's some mitigation strategies and time to kind of time to kind of clean all that stuff up. But also there's value we've seen in the past in some of these larger leagues where additional bidders can come in. So it may force attention to the deal. Somebody may think that bid's undervalued, come in with a higher bid and drive some additional value that way. And maybe also I think generally to test sometimes the regulatory market, right? If you announce a deal or if a deal leaks a little bit earlier, and you start to get reactions from, maybe not the regulators themselves, but from sort of the general populace about, ooh, we don't know if that deal is going to actually get through or come to fruition. I think it's a good litmus test sometimes. Probably not the majority of the reason that deals are leaked, but definitely has happened.
So you spent some time now talking about, leaks and that they happen. The big question is, how do we avoid them? How can we maintain confidentiality in an M&A process? Matt, can you talk to us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I think as Nitin mentioned, I think it's going to be impossible to ever bring that to zero, right? You're always going to have the person involved in the deal that's on an airplane reading a physical piece of paper, and maybe somebody in the middle seat looking over and sees that is happening and sends out something on social media, or somebody leaves a piece of paper in a cab. Those kind of mistakes might always happen. But in terms of, mitigating against leaks, I think it really comes down to the number of parties involved. And we've seen, through our research that, the number of parties over the last 10 years involved in these M&A deals has grown exponentially. And what's interesting is that leaks have not necessarily grown exponentially, but they're still happening. And I think controlling that, initial group as much as possible, and making sure that everybody understands the impacts, both, primarily negative to elite, and has it keeps the deal team as small as possible for as long as possible, because we've seen that, as the time goes on throughout a deal, the group starts to expand and the potential for leaks goes up.
Nitin, can I bring you into the conversation at this point and ask you to talk to me about what kind of key tools, key processes in your experience have helped maintain that confidentiality during an M&A process?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a common scenario that, especially in a public company deal, you kind of plan for, but not hope for, right? So one scenario is that we generally use to war game if it's a large deal, right? What happens and then if this, that scenario? It's like who leaks, from where it leaks, what is the implication on capital markets, regulatory, and arguably now even nation states and sanction states, given the geopolitical landscape, right? That said, you can put controls. One thing is to put a control, and the second thing is effectiveness of the control, right? So we generally use very tightly controlled VDRs. I think the governance process has to be very clear that you can't have them on spreadsheets and all kinds of skunk work, storage devices and XYZ, right? So that process has to be set in upfront in the governance. Eliminate general logins, generic logins, print restrictions, stay against using unique watermarks. I think you can also go to the other extreme and start to do email metadata, which is, a lot of us are trained to embed beacons, which is don't target those emails. As Matt said, onboard vendors properly. And above all the deal people need to undergo security training, and especially how to use the virtual data room. In my experience, the main problem is that if people aren't trained, right, they're not going to change their behavior. If they don't know how to use a particular data room, they go and default into Excel and say, I'm going to deal with this later. So it's not only important to onboard them to the M&A process, the legality, the governance, the security, also on the tools and technology. One of the biggest things is that if I'm not familiar with the tool, I default to my old habit. So it's not like a big change management project, but that onboarding is pretty critical on what to do, what not to do, what to click, what not to click, who to invite, who not to invite. So if you generally put this ingrained into the onboarding of the people, I think it does help a lot.
Thank you very much. Matt, I feel that I have to bring you in on this conversation as well. Talk to us from your perspective, from Intralinks' perspective. What specifically do you have in place to ensure that confidentiality?
Yeah, I think with every good virtual data room and virtual data room hygiene and goal management, ensuring, the right people have the right access to the right content at the right time is absolutely critical, right? Also setting up, NDAs, or even when you enter a data room, having to agree to, a specific splash page that has, policies around what you could do with that content. I think, there's not one single silver bullet, but I think there are a number of, small things that you can continue to put in place in layers that will help prevent deal leaks. And it's interesting. You'd think that, with the opening of a virtual data room, a small number of people or even a medium number of people have now access to all this information around a deal. And you think there would be a correlation with the opening of a virtual data room with, when leaks start to occur. And with our research, we found that that's not the case. The leaks usually occur, far after, almost 2 months after that virtual data room is open. So if you think maybe then as the deal starts to grow in size in terms of number of parties that are involved in the deal, that's likely the causation there, but it is not related to the opening of virtual data room. I think virtual data room is a key tool in really preventing leaks as long as it's used correctly.
Thank you very much for your comments there, Matt. We're going to take a really short break. And after the break, we're going to have a look at the unintended consequences and how to navigate those.
We're for the value creators, the game changers, the trailblazers who make global markets thrive. We bring you the world's most comprehensive fintech ecosystem, where advanced technology and award-winning support equip you to seamlessly connect capital to opportunity. Now, turbocharged with Link, our purpose-built, ultra-secure AI, the engine that accelerates everything, empowering you to excel through greater efficiency, clearer insight, faster decisions, so you can add value to the world's businesses, economies, communities, 24/7. This is power. This is progress. This is state-of-the-art advantage. SS&C Intralinks. Go forward.
We're back. And Dan, I want to come to you now and give us if you can give us an oversight of the impact that a deal leak can have on the overall due diligence process and indeed the overall success of a transaction. Can you share some of your experiences with us?
So leaks can have a very profound effect on the negotiation process for a transaction, but also on how the transaction is ultimately received by the market or stakeholders of a company involved. On one hand, they can cause the parties involved to press pause and delay, depending on reaction that they hear. It can also have the opposite effect where it can cause the parties to accelerate and really hustle to get a deal done. You see this especially somewhat frequently in public company deals, depending on how a company's stock reacts to rumors of a leak. That may cause the parties to move quickly to get the deal signed. But it's also very true, and I think this is underappreciated, that leaks can kill a deal process. We have absolutely seen situations where customers, employees, regulators have sent very clear signals to the company that they didn't like this deal, so much so that company decided and the board decided, well, maybe this isn't the right time for this. So that is absolutely a factor that can come into play. And, when I think of where our seat and how we help companies through the communications and stakeholder engagement process, through transactions. One important fact is we've looked at media coverage at transaction leaks compared to the actual announcement. And the announcement is, of course, the time that the companies have prepared for. They've prepared this terrific messaging about the rationale and the great benefits of the deal for all the stakeholders that matter. That's gone through legal review and the board review, and it's ready for the public market. But the challenge is media pays so much more attention at the time of a leak. Our analysis found something like 300% more of media volume happened at the leak versus at the announcement. And so the risk there is that for companies whose deal gets leaked, the conversation about that transaction can happen without you. And so that's why it's really important to prepare in advance and be ready for the possibility of leaks.
Does that have something to do with the fact that you don't have your narrative in place, you don't have your story in place, you don't have your facts and figures, and as you say, you're not actually the one controlling the narrative? So how much prep work, Dan, can a company actually do, because you don't really know when that leak is going to happen? You know, there's obviously points in time where, say, at the point where the short list of bidders has been narrowed down, or someone has been taken into exclusivity. I mean, is it really as tricky as you're going to have to just prepare that it might leak at any time in the overall schedule, and just have various game plans lined up and ready to go?
That's exactly right. And usually at that point that you outlined is the right point where we would work with companies to prepare what we call a leak scenario plan, which is essentially gaming out all the various ways that a leak could occur, whether it's through media, from other perhaps investors, from just a happenstance accident, customer employee chatter, for example, varying degrees of escalation and severity. And then at each step along the way for those scenarios, what are the immediate steps a company needs to take? What can they say? What can they not say? And how can they manage through each scenario while communicating as best they can to the groups that matter most to the company? That can be a very complicated process. If leaks happen through media, they happen very quickly. And so building that muscle memory in advance is really essential for companies to navigate through these scenarios the right way.
So it's all about staying in control.
Exactly.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Nitin, let me bring you into the conversation, and let's talk a little bit about those unintended leaks. How can the consequences be mitigated, and how can the fallout be dealt with? What should companies have lined up? How should they prepare those next steps?
Yeah, I think, look, Dan alluded to this a little bit. I think you have to reshape and rebuild the narrative. You've got to investigate the source of the leak and kind of put a mitigation in place, right? And then there are these operational consequences, right? Which is really either if you look at the Qualcomm-Broadcom deal, the regulatory thing kind of dragged that ever and the deal got killed, right? Then I've seen mass executive defection after the deal, right? So you got to sort of put and sometimes the value is in that management team and what they brought the company to, right? So you got to put some measures there, right? The second problem is that we usually see, if it's a deal is very large, there is also another counter narrative that comes in on the breakup and the repricing of the deal, right? That's actually pretty critical. It's kind of challenging to defend shareholder value. So you almost have to rebuild the narrative or dismiss the narrative or change the narrative, right? And then again, that depends on the deal and the deal leakage point and what the source is. But there are many reasons why this can happen at a strategic level. At a tactical level, then it has to get into the operations of the company and take a look at what can you do to protect the source and sustainability of the competitive advantage, be it in that executive team, certain projects or certain locations or whatnot.
Matt, let me bring you in and let's have a conversation around the topic of restoring confidence and what happens after a leak has happened. Can you talk us through some of your experiences when it comes to that particular issue of a leak? How do we restore confidence after such an event has taken place?
I think first and foremost, at least between the deal parties, it comes back to restoring trust, right? I think that's critical. And if you don't have that, then the deal's on uneven ground, shaky ground, and I think that the odds of that deal actually coming to fruition, significantly decline. So I think the focus really is in initially restoring trust between the deal parties, confidence that the leak has been addressed, they identify where the leak came from, and they have processes in place to ensure that that doesn't happen again going forward. And then restoring that trust between the deal parties and also between the market as well. I think that's key. And also just clarifying, what the leak was, how it happened, what was exposed, if there was some confidential information that should not have been exposed. Getting out in front of it, I think, is key, and then getting proper protocols in place to move forward from a place of trust is essential.
We're almost out of time, so I would like to ask each of you to give me sort of your top 3 tips when it comes to the issue of dealing with leaks, but also how to maintain confidentiality during an M&A process. Dan, could I ask you for your top 3 first of all?
Absolutely. I think first and foremost, number one, I would say is be prepared. Number 2 would be know the stakeholder groups that matter to your company and have a plan to reach them when you need to. And then number 3 is be flexible and nimble.
Okay, thank you very much. Nitin, from your perspective, top 3, please.
Okay, so I think one is be aware that you are going from a user-generated leak era into a machine-generated leak era. Just 10 minutes before the call, I was playing around with ChatGPT. Everyone that's searching for every target and all that stuff, I could create a fairly okay blueprint in 10 minutes. Now, I'm sure if I spend 30 minutes and sharpen my prompts, I'm going to get a much better, clearer picture on who's searching for what target where. So beware that the era is shifting, and it's no longer going to be linear damage. It's going to be exponential damage and virality if you get your things into every LLM out there, right? So the consequences can be damaging and much more faster. I would say prepare for deal leaks. Okay, it's something that we don't want to, but war game the scenario and have a counter narrative ready, have a sharpened narrative ready, and have your media outlets ready to go should this happen.
Thank you very much. Matt, would you like to wrap us up on the topic of top 3 tips for preventing leaks in an M&A process and how to prepare should they happen after all?
Yeah, I think number 1 is good governance, right? Who you involve in the deal and when is essential, and being very intentional about that and setting strict controls. When you start to open a VDR and we start to initially share materials, ensuring that you're using, the most secure, the most trusted vendors out there. I think those are sort of my first 2. And one may not be a tip, but an observation that we've learned through our research, actually. We've looked at deal leaks since 2009 in conjunction with the Bay Score. We've also looked at deal leaks with a cross-section of how gender diverse is the executive team and the board in particular. And we found that there's a significant correlation between more gender diverse boards and less deal leaks. So, maybe that's a tip. Add some gender diversity to your board, but we've definitely seen a correlation in the data, which is quite interesting.
Nitin, do you want to respond to that?
No, I was saying that it's not only humans part of the deal now, machines are also part of the deal now, right?
Matt, do you think we count the machines as part of the diversity as well?
I suppose so. I don't know which gender we should them, but we won't get into that today.
Great. Thank you very much to all of you. That's all that we have time for in today's episode, The Dealist. I'm sure all of you listeners will join me in thanking Dan, Matt, and Nitin for sharing their insights into how to deal with confidentiality and leaks in an M&A process. If you found this podcast valuable, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and share us with your colleagues in the industry. Join us for our next podcast. And until, thank you very much for listening and goodbye.